And one of the questions, or one of the objectives, is to discuss the wealth gap and what do we feel has kept us from making progress. What can we learn from history, and what role does public policy play in balancing market forces that divide us? And then just sharing a bit about where we are leading just partnering in that work and what our learnings have been.
Yep, so we got it. So we'll answer that question when everybody's looking at us then.
Yep.
Well, it's good to meet you, Denetrick. I'm excited to do this for the next hour. We're gonna get to know each other at the same time. We're gonna be preaching some knowledge, which is cool.
Most definitely. Are you from the Twin Cities? I guess
Yeah. Yes, I work in Minneapolis right now as a chief resilience officer. Thinking about urban resilience around 3 pillars: racial equity, economic inclusion, and climate change mitigation. Been at the city for a few years now. Originally from Chicago, but I moved up here when I was like 11 or something like that. So yeah, originally from the Twin Cities.
Word.
A lot of organizing work, a lot of political work, all that.
For sure. Did you grow up on a particular side of the river?
I'm sorry?
So did you grow up on a particular side of the river, side of town?
Not really. Never in St. Paul, but a lot of time in Minneapolis, a little bit of time in the suburbs, back to Minneapolis, and now I live in New Brighton.
Okay, word.
Yep.
My mom's family is, my mom, my grandpa, this side of the family, my grandma, they're originally from St. Paul town, over in the Rondo neighborhood. And my grandpa moved to North Minneapolis when my mom was a teenager in her freshman year in high school. And she been over there since, but I've bounced back and forth, on both sides of the river. Spent a little bit of time. I spent a year in Milwaukee during 7th grade.
Suburb of Chicago, huh?
Basically. The worst living experience I had. I'm not a fan of Milwaukee. That's another conversation though. Yeah. But primarily, I always had family in North Minneapolis. So that's kind of where I was most of the time.
Great. Lots of people eager, ready to join. So, are we okay to begin? Should I let people in?
I'm ready.
Good. Okay.
Oh snap.
Hi everyone, welcome to the session. We will get things started in just a second. We're letting a few more people join. I think we're ready to get started.
Word. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining myself, Denetrick Powers, Ron Harris, and Andrea Jenkins, as we talk about truth, reconciliation, and the wealth gap. We'll start our session off with just a quick introduction from each of us, so that we understand kind of who we are, where we're coming from, the work that we're doing, and then we'll follow with the kind of open audience engagement, giving people the opportunity to introduce yourself if you want to. We don't have to go through everybody, but I just take 10 minutes for people to introduce themselves, maybe give you an opportunity to let us know kind of what you're looking forward to getting out of this presentation. And then we'll jump into kind of discussing some of our objectives for this morning. I can begin. My name is Denetrick Powers. I am the co-founder and director of planning and engagement for NEOO Partners. We're a real estate development consulting firm and urban planning firm. We launched 2 years ago. My business partner, D'Angelo Sfingenson, and I both worked at Thor as a part of their commercial real estate group prior to launching NEOO Partners. Before getting into real estate, I got into real estate and urban planning through community organizing in the Harrison neighborhood in North Minneapolis. It's also where I grew up at. I was a community organizer for 2 years, specifically around transit-oriented development. At the time, Met Council, Metro Transit, and the city were doing their station area planning for the Blue Line extension, as well as Southwest Light Rail. So I kind of jumped in head first, didn't really know what I was getting into. One thing I did realize was that, kind of our environment and our lives were being planned 10, 20 years out, which really interested me because, as a part of that work, I noticed that we were being very reactive to issues that kind of had already been set in motion before we were just being reactive, in short, and that, there need to be proactive in planning, kind of getting an understanding of, how ideas are being planned around policy, and how those ideas are being implemented, through urban planning and through real estate development, which is how I got into real estate development. I also went to the Humphrey for grad school, so I'm a Humphrey alumni. My focus was on social entrepreneurship, so I do have a specific interest in kind of public and private partnerships. So understanding that it is going to take both in order to close the racial wealth gap, and just to catalyze change in our communities.
So maybe I should go next. My name is Andrea Jenkins, and I am the Vice President of the Minneapolis City Council. I really have a pretty long career in serving the community. I was listening to Denetrick and just thinking back to when I was deeply engaged in transit-oriented development and worked for the Northside Redevelopment Corporation to create, more housing in the community, specifically around Heritage Park. But even prior to that, I worked in North Minneapolis for Turning Point, and really helping young, recovering addicts to get back into the workplace and workforce. And then I subsequently worked for Hennepin County for about 12 years, helping single moms and people on probation find employment and get into training programs. And one of the things that led me to get engaged in political life is that I would see the same issues that brought people forward like every day, and it just became more and more painful to recognize that, you know, even and helping individuals is absolutely important, and it was really rewarding work to be doing. However, it became very clear that there were systemic issues that were at play that continued to bring the same people through the doors of the county, through the doors of a place like Turning Point. And so I wanted to take it to the next level and be able to impact a broader level of people and issues. And, you know, one of the things that happened while I was at Hennepin County in 1996, Bill Clinton, then President Bill Clinton, introduced the Welfare Reform Act, or TANF as it is known now, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. And working in that system, I realized that was one of the absolute worst policies that happened to Black women in this country since slavery. And I still believe that to this day. It said that, you know, people receiving public assistance could only receive public assistance for 5 years. And then after that, you're on your own. And at the same time, they were saying you can only receive it for 5 years, and you can only receive it if you are working and or looking for work or in school. And at the same time that messaging was happening, they were telling white moms that your kids from 1 to 5 these are the most important times in your child's life, and you should stay home. You should be with those kids to help them develop. But yet, women of color, Black moms, Latino moms, go out and get a job. And, you know, seeing that policy made me recognize how deeply impactful these policies are on our lives. And, you know, I know people watch the news and they see, you know, what's happening in Washington, D.C., and it sometimes feels like it's disconnected, but it's all very, very, very connected, and it all impacts our daily lives every day. And so I decided to get into public policy. I went and pursued, while I was still working, I pursued a degree in community economic development, which is about how do we make our communities stronger? How do we make our communities more resilient? It's about job training. It's about housing development. It's about the improving the social determinants of health for people's lives. And so, you know, I wanted to take a broader step. And when I completed that 2-year program at Southern New Hampshire University, I was invited by then a candidate for the city council, but he became a city council member, Robert Lilligren, to be a part of his team, his administration, as it were. I got hooked on electoral politics as a way to really change our culture and society. And I don't think it's the only way. In fact, I know it's not, but I know it's one tool that we can use. I believe in a 3-legged stool approach. I absolutely understand that we need social services because people in their lives need food, clothing, housing, shelter, all of those things. But we also need advocates and agitators and protesters, really, to bring to light the issues that are impacting our communities. And then we need people in these roles in government to really take that information and try to make change. And so that's the work that I am doing now. I mentioned to my co-panelists a little bit earlier that right before this call, I was on another call, and this group is still meeting to begin a Truth and Reconciliation Commission at the city of Minneapolis. I brought forward a resolution establishing that work, and I'm proud to say that all 12 of my colleagues on the city council, including the mayor, so I should say all 13, all 14 of us, unanimously approved this Truth and Reconciliation process. And it's going to be some difficult and challenging, but hopefully very rewarding work. In the end, we must begin to address the systemic issues that are plaguing our community and society. Last night, I was on a 7-hour Zoom public meeting hearing from our community about public safety. And public safety is a tremendous issue, and it's a tremendous area where racism plays out. But I want to be very clear, racism permeates every single institution in our society. And so just addressing the issues in the public safety space is not going to transform our society. We're going to have to transform every institution to make things possible. So I'm just really looking forward to this conversation and sharing with the participants on this call and really hearing from you guys as well.
Hey everybody, my name is Ron Harris. I am the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Minneapolis. I work with Council Vice President Andrea Jenkins at City Hall. I'm really grateful to be here this morning on this panel of really amazing guests. Shout out to CEI for hosting the panel, and thank you for the invitation. I see some friends in the room. Amanda, I see you, Carol Latofsky, Commissioner Freetham, Commissioner Carter. There's so many great folks who joined us this morning. Kate Semino, thanks for being here. This conversation around truth and reconciliation could not, in my opinion, come at a better time, nor could there be a more relevant conversation for us to be having. As you all know, likely better than us on this panel, we're facing a three-headed monster this year when it comes to COVID-19 and economic fallout as a result. And then, of course, the murder of George Floyd, which set off a racial awakening, a reckoning all across the world. And it started this conversation, or I should say catalyzed this conversation about truth and reconciliation. I got started in this work back in 2008, actually, as a freshman in college at Hampton University. I remember at the time, Barack Obama had just got the nomination for Democratic nomination for president. And being at Hampton, a historically Black college, the majority of us were really fired up about the fact that we, are on the cusp of making history. I started knocking on doors, and I started to connect people's stories with policy and political outcomes, recognizing the fact that, like you said, Council Vice President, that politics and government and electoral work isn't the only way to make change, but it is one of the more powerful ways to make change. That it's one of our best opportunities to improve people's lives. After volunteering on that campaign and playing a role in helping, Virginia turn blue and elect the president, I was hooked on public service. I was hooked on community organizing as a pathway, and making sure that as we do this work, we're elevating the stories of those who are the most marginalized and those who are the most vulnerable. When you think about 2020, so embedded in our society that even a virus that has no conscience, that has no history, right, that's brand new on the scene, even a virus and those impacts have uneven consequences. We know that 2 to 3 times, Black folks and brown folks are 2 to 3 times more likely to catch the virus. They're also more likely to be essential workers, They're also more likely to be working multiple part-time jobs to piece together a decent income. And if you go down the list, these are also folks who don't have adequate access to healthcare and don't have adequate access to affordable housing and don't have adequate access to good jobs. And so that if the disasters and if our problems are linked, then our solutions must be linked as well. That it isn't just up to public servants to lead the charge as it relates to making change. We have to start to develop strategic multi-sector partnerships. We have to engage the private sector in helping us alleviate these problems. And we have to be honest about what our problems are and how we got here. It's one thing to check individual racism and to check individual actions, and it's another to be able to link those actions, to your point, Council Vice President, to the systemic nature of this stuff, right? And I think that when George Floyd was murdered, a lot of us have been working on the system, but I think it made it very clear for the rest of us who haven't necessarily engaged at that level that our problems are systemic, that it isn't just Black Lives Matter, it's all Black Lives Matter, right? That the revolution might not be televised, but it will be intersectional. And we love saying that, right? That if you're someone who is disproportionately impacted by police brutality or inadequate criminal justice, you're likely to be somebody who's breathing in bad air and drinking bad water. And you're likely to be somebody who goes to schools that are underfunded or under-resourced, right? So what we recognize is that nobody lives their lives in silo. Nobody lives their life and is only impacted by one thing. And we're starting to see the through line between marginalization and vulnerability, right? The nexus of struggle is what I like to call it. So I'm grateful that we're having this conversation today. I'm grateful that we're going to start to tell the truth. There's no way that we can solve our problems without telling the truth. There will be a lot of tension as we do this work, but I've been a firm believer that, like a muscle, growth happens through tension. That the only way that we can grow is get real and get serious and tell the truth and introduce a little bit of what Congressman John Lewis used to say, I'm a little bit of good trouble. So again, thanks for the invitation, and I'm excited to dive into the discussion.
Well, thank you, Ron, and thank you, Andrea. At this time, I just want to give audience members an opportunity. We'll take 5 minutes. Give audience members an opportunity to introduce themselves if they would like, and then also to speak on kind of what do you feel has kept us from making progress when it comes to the wealth gap and racial wealth gap. And if you don't want to say anything out loud, you're welcome to just type it into the chat, your response, or introduce yourself through the chat as well.
My name is Latoya Burrell. I will be brief in the interest of time. So first and foremost, thank you all for the introductions and for the opportunity to engage in a space like this. I am intrigued by the topic. I recently wrote a book on racial reconciliation that was inspired after the death of George Floyd. And one of the things that I've been studying and I'm also interested in is the idea of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So it made me very happy to hear of the others on the call who are interested, as well as the work that has been done. And I'm looking forward to hearing more and continuing to connect in this shared space. So thank you so much and looking forward to the rest of the presentation.
You wrote a book since George Floyd was murdered?
I did. I was inspired to write the book. So I work at North Central University and we hosted the George Floyd Memorial. And
I was there.
We always say, if not who, if not me, then who, and if not now, then when. And I just put the pedal to the metal, and the book released officially on November 1st. So yes.
Wow, that's quite an incredible feat. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Feel free to jump right in.
I'll go. I'm Raki. I'm a Northsider, and thank you guys for hosting this. This is what I've been waiting for and doing on my own time. So to answer the question, what has kept us from making progress when it comes to wealth and being Black people? I'd like to just echo something that Kenya McKnight said yesterday, and was that we're never representing ourselves, when it comes to our economic agenda. We're always thrown under the people of color umbrella. And yeah, we can be inclusive and, we can love one another. But at the end of the day, the Native folks have their agenda. White folks definitely got their agenda. Latino folks have their agenda. Everyone has their own thing going on. It seems like we collectively, all of us, I don't think we're organized enough. There's not enough unity. There's all these things coming at us. There's child support, welfare, all these policies that Andrea was talking about. And I think that affects our spirit. And we also have to talk about that, us as human beings. We're spiritual. It's not just about money, being poor. It's about the conditions and the environments that we're living in as well. So that's my 2 cents.
I appreciate it, Raki. I think I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm glad that you brought up Kenya McKnight too, who I am friends with. Very familiar with her work and what she's doing with the Black Women's Wealth Alliance. In North Minneapolis and just across the Twin Cities. And I agree with her that we do often, as the African American community, Black community, that we often do get. I would say distracted, by terms like BIPOC, by terms like, POC, because we do have our own individual, we have our own culture as Black people here in America, and it permeates through. Our culture, you can argue, is pop culture. I mean, one of the things that I recognized when I was doing community organizing and kind of just looking at, urban planning is that one thing I noticed when it came to economic development strategies and policies is that there were strategies and policies for supporting different cultural corridors or kind of these cultural districts, and they often focused on immigrant communities, which is great. I think that they add value to our cities, but I always question why, you have Little Mekong, you have Chinese districts, Japanese districts, Latinx districts, all across the United States. And I also always wondered where were the Black districts? And I know that we have them. I'm sure that we have them, and they may not be called out. But I think that that's something that economic development strategies could do. I mean, one of the things that I'm noticing, in the work that I'm doing right now in Ramsey County, is that a lot of community members are, more aware, are becoming more aware of that, and do want to see economic development strategies that are supporting, the African American community specifically, and that isn't just coming from Black residents. That's coming from all types of residents. With people just realizing, which may have been catalyzed by the death of George Floyd, but people are realizing that, hey, we need to be more intentional about supporting Black community members. So I appreciate you for bringing that up.
I mean, you bring up a really good point. I think in a lot of ways we do get caught up when we group ourselves all up together, BIPOC, communities of color, what have you. I think those titles and those categorizations are important and useful in some aspects, but I think as it relates to this specific problem, Black folks in this moment need specific intentionality as it relates to investments, as it relates to prioritization. Everyone always talks about a rising tide lifts all boats, and that's just not true. Not everybody has a boat, not everybody's even in the water. And so if that's the case, then we need specific and intentional measures and actions in order to address a lot of these things. This is when we talk about reconciliation. This is when we talk about reparations, right? Because there were specific harms against the Black community, there has to be specific redress for the Black community, right? That this can't just be a simple catch-all. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
I got one more thing to say. It just popped into my mind, especially thinking about the history. in our efforts throughout history. I was on a flight the other day and watching Harriet, so my mind's kind of been around revolutionaries lately. I won't criticize the movie, but I say all that to say that I think nonprofits, the creation of nonprofits, also kind of messed up the Black community because they came in, and I'm talking specifically around the Black Panther era. You know, there's amazing nonprofits nowadays, but I think the death of the Black Panther Party and how the feds took us out, basically, or them out, I think that really affected us. And every time they come in and they ruin a Black community like Rondo, you know, those are Black Wall Streets all across the country. So, you know, just again to echo that it's within every system, redlining, all of that. So we have to collectively, you know, me working in environmentalism, I have to connect with people at the city because we have to talk about tactical urbanism efforts and, you know, things along those lines. We have to connect with the schools because we need to be talking to youth and telling them about the future and how they're the future and whatnot. But I'll stop taking all the time because I know we probably passed 5 minutes. So yeah, that's all.
You know, thank you for transitioning us into our first discussion topic, which was the question that I put into the chat about what do you feel has kept us from making progress. You know, also, I do believe that nonprofits have prevented us from making progress when it comes to the wealth gap. The reason that I say that is because nonprofits they're not developed to they're not developed to like solve an issue, you know, so they don't work themselves out of a job. You know, so and I see this often with nonprofits, especially in North Minneapolis, you know, who are I mean, they're poverty pimps. I mean, they need poor people, specifically poor Black people, in order for them to continue getting funded. You know, and that if there were no poor Black people, you know, a lot of nonprofits wouldn't exist. But I do believe nonprofit as a business entity structure can play a role in terms of, you know, providing resources, you know, whether that's education resources, you know, whether that's, you know, supporting, you know, housing, you know, supporting job training, you know, supporting skills building in order for people to, you know, continue developing personally, you know, and also, you know, developing as professionals in our communities. I'll pass it on to Ron and you have anything else to say?
Yeah, I think answering that question directly, one of the things that I think keeps us from making progress is that not everybody sees their role as contributing to the solution in this work. That they think that, oh, I don't work in politics, or oh, I'm not a public servant, therefore I don't have any responsibility whatsoever to address systems of inequity, to address systems of anti-Blackness, right? And yet with their day-to-day actions, they continue to perpetuate anti-Blackness in all of its forms. I think that's one of the biggest problems. I think that we actually can't let the private sector off the hook in terms of being part of the problem solvers, right? I think oftentimes we get after them for violating a whole host of other issues, whether it's environmentalism or if it's not paying people properly or what have you, but we don't recruit them often enough to be our partners in the solution, right? And so I think there's a huge opportunity there. I think that what's also keeping us back is that we need to do more work as it relates to educating and politicizing our people, meaning that we can't just show up with a huge new policy proposal or some sort of a slogan or some sort of a rallying call without having done the work of getting people prepared for that moment, right? That we need to be having conversations about political education outside of elections, right? That I tell people all the time, elections isn't the finish line, it's a starting line. That's the point where we get people involved and we got to keep on going, right? So outside of elections, we need to do that level of community organizing, making sure people know their power, making sure people know their resources, making sure people believe in themselves, and making sure people's wants and desires as it relates to policy or their outcomes are somehow reflected at every single level, right? It shouldn't just be up to the city council to, as an example, to address every single problem the city faces, right? I would love to recruit the Chamber of Commerce to be a part of this conversation. I would love to recruit CEOs of our top Fortune 500 companies to be a part of the conversation, right? There is a way, in my opinion, to define reparations and define reparative justice where everybody can contribute and make sure that we can fill that gap, right? We could talk about reparative justice as it relates to economic means. We could talk about it as it relates to housing needs. We can talk about it as it relates to business capital. I mean, we can get really, really creative. So answering the question, what's kept us from making progress, I think not everybody sees this as their role. And, you know, in Minneapolis, you know, most folks know this, we have the highest per capita Fortune 500 companies of any city in the US, right? We got a lot of them, which means that we have an environment that I think is conducive to economic success and economic prosperity. So if we have an environment that's conducive to that and people are benefiting from that environment, we need to make the case for them to contribute back to that environment that they benefited from, right? They're benefiting from a very high class of workers who are educated, who work very, very hard. We have a very diverse economy. If you benefit from those things, you must contribute back to those things, right? Because my community, we've been extracted from for 400 years. 400 years. We can't keep recruiting people to come and speak on these issues and we not put money in their pockets, right? We can't keep highlighting just a handful of leaders and not developing the rest of the community. You know, so I think holistically, that's what we've been missing, and that's been holding us back significantly from making progress.
All really excellent points. I don't know if I can elaborate too much further, but what I will say, and maybe stating the obvious, you know, a big part of what's holding us back is that there is real and significant opposition to progress. You know, 80 million people voted for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to lead our country, but 70+ million people voted for number 45. Let me just put it that way. And so, you know, there is very real, very sustained, very well financed and organized opposition to progress. And yet we still do continue to progress. So I want to really just, you know, lift up, you know, there's certainly obstacles, and, you know, many of them have been named. The nonprofit industrial complex plays a significant role in opposition, as has been stated. You know, the institutional systemic racism that is built into every system in our system and institution in our country is certainly obstacles. But, you know, the progress is enormous. I mean, 100 years ago, women couldn't vote. Now they can. The civil rights movement of the 1960s brought forth huge changes in our culture and society. It didn't get us completely to where we need to be, but we must acknowledge that progress. The LGBT movement has brought progress. Just 2 days ago, HIV was World AIDS Day, and the struggle around HIV and AIDS has brought more awareness and conversations around health equity in our communities. And so, you know, progress is slow and it's incremental. And it really is challenging sometimes to see in the midst of the deep poverty, the deep prison industrial complex that continues to disrupt our communities, the attacks on the environment that, you know, as Ron mentioned, that, you know, the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, and it's a constant struggle. But you know, we must persist. We must keep fighting. We must keep moving forward to continue that progress. I mean, you know, Ron, you talked about being descendants, African descendants of slavery. That, you know, people thought slavery would never end. People thought abolitionists were crazy. And yet we prevailed. And so we have to stay hopeful. We have to remain diligent and think aggressive in our pursuit of justice and reconciliation. And we, I mean, 20 years ago, nobody was having a conversation about reparations. If you watched the last Democratic debates prior to the nomination of the current president-elect, every one of those 18 candidates said the word reparations and talked about it in very real ways. That's progress, my friends. So, you know, we got to stay on the battlefield.
I don't think we talk about that enough. I actually don't think we talk about the progress that we have made enough, even though it's incremental in a lot of ways, and even though it's falling short of where we really want to get to, but we're still on the journey. And I think it's, you know, I think it's necessary for us to look back and say, wait a minute, look how far we've come in whatever time period, to give us, at the very least, number one, a little bit of energy and encouragement to keep going. But number two, I think there's some real lessons to be learned, right? We can ask ourselves the question, how did reparations become a mainstream conversation, right? It started off with organizers and activists making a bunch of noise and advocating at every single table and being disruptive and being loud and getting in good trouble. And some people got arrested for getting in trouble, right? And then over time, it got the populace ready for this conversation to now where it is today, where people are writing books and articles about it. And, you know, someone shouted out decolonizing wealth in the chat, right? Talking about how wealth has actually been built and what we need to do to reconcile with that as a fact. So I do think it's important for us to look at and not be satisfied with the progress that we've made, but certainly be proud of a lot of things that we have done, despite the very real barriers and challenges that are right in front of us every single day.
There's a question Kirsten Voss has put into the chat. Do panelists have examples of ways we have successfully engaged the private sector, such as Fortune 500 companies, in this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think there are some significant private-public partnerships, public-private partnerships, however you want to frame it. But I don't think there's enough. I think that, you know, we still have private corporations that are coming to government expecting support beyond what Ron talked about, the fact that, you know, as a society, as a nation, we educate people to be prepared to work in these corporations. We build the roads so that they can drive trucks and deliver their goods and services. We build the airport so people can move about freely. And as you guys probably are aware of, you know, Amazon would not exist without the infrastructure that has been built by taxpayers. And so I don't think that there has been enough public-private partnerships. You know, I've been on Zoom all day, but I'm hoping that that we may be hearing about a significant public-private partnership from Mayor Fry later today that can help us in this really tumultuous moment in the city's history, as we grapple with the coronavirus, as we grapple with the racial reckoning that Ron talked about, as we grapple with the very real and serious upticks in crime and concerns around public safety. You know, as was stated earlier, everybody has a role in this. And everybody has got to step up into that role. You know, I mean, what are some public-private partnerships? I guess, you know, we're talking, Ron Harris is on this call, and, you know, the work that he is doing is being supported by a private entity. I think it's the Bloomberg Foundation, or, you know, and so I think that's an example of a public-private partnership. You know, and we have to, I think, continue to push that. I wish that there were more sort of academic and public partnerships. The assets that our educational institutions have are enormous, from the brain power to the people power, and quite frankly, to the financial resources that they have. They should be playing a major role in helping to repair the harms done by our communities. And in most of the academic institutions, including the University of Minnesota, were built on and built by slave labor or proceeds from slave labor. The University of Minnesota, at a point in time when they were about to close down because they just didn't have the financial resources, got a $7,500 loan, $7,500 loan from a slaveholder, and then was subsequently unable to pay it back. So the University of Minnesota history, it would not exist if it wasn't for those dollars that they got from a slaveholder that they have never paid back. And so, you know, we need to understand that history, and we need to hold these institutions accountable as well. I mean, we know Princeton, Harvard, Yale, all of these schools were built, Brown University, were built with the proceeds and revenues from slave labor. And as well as these corporations, insurance companies, they all played a major role in the horrific history of slavery in this country. And they have a responsibility to repair those harms.
And I think that's, you know, I can't agree more. And I think when we think about, you know, my job in resilience is all about thinking about how do we not only mitigate disaster, but we absorb and adapt to the changes that a disaster brings us. And one of the opportunities that can come out of chaos is this kind of inspiration for change, this kind of inspiration for these corporations and others to step up. Like we saw when George Floyd was murdered, every corporation and their mother came out with statements, and some came up with dedicated money, right? They didn't dedicate that money with the mindset of we're going to work with community and how we're going to, get this dispersed. They did it like, hey, this is what we got to do in the moment. And I don't think it was very thoughtful about what that framework looked like for how those investments could actually be, or actually can yield the highest return in the moment. A couple examples at the city that I can name of public-private partnerships. We have a clean energy partnership at the city, which is a commission of residents, some city staff, and some corporations on how we use energy in the city is one small example. Target, a few years back, helped pass some policy. Paid sick time is one of them, minimum wage is another, by being a corporate partner and backing those things up and implementing some of those things before the law was actually passed. Right now, the Chamber of Commerce is on our Minneapolis Forward Coalition, which they're talking a lot about how these corporations can reinvest back into the community while our city's resources are kind of scarce right now. Our city's economies are densely woven tapestries, but during this pandemic, our local government resources have been really limited. So we do need these multi-sector strategic partnerships of nonprofits, foundations, corporations, higher ed, to aid in the recovery. And I think the most important part of this is that not only do we need them now, we need to develop those partnerships so that they maintain themselves in the future, even while we're not in emergency times. See, what happens far too often is that people step up in emergencies, they do their part, they wipe their hands, and they keep on moving once we've recovered. I'm making the case that we maintain a lot of these partnerships and a lot of these strategic relationships far beyond the moment that we're in currently. Because again, they do have a role in contributing to the environment and helping to alleviate some of these challenges, particularly because they've benefited from 400 years of extraction in a lot of ways of our people.
A very good point. I have a couple of questions in the chat that I'm gonna, as a panelist, to respond to. But before I do want to go back and just answer some of the ways about engaging the private sector on this conversation about the wealth gap and truth and reconciliation. There are ways, one of the ways that I see private sector, they are, some private sector participants, I see them, engaging in kind of, in employee culture, for the diverse employees. I see them, some of them are trying to adhere to, better wages. Some other ideas that I've heard, through some engagement activities that I've done is, just around how do we create better, mentoring opportunities, between some of these larger companies and small businesses. I think that, organizations such as META, for instance, I think they do a good job at, connecting large Fortune 500 companies with, small businesses, through procurement. I think that's a way that the public sector, specifically local government, can get behind. And also, in short, I think there's a lot of ways, but I think that there needs to be more direct financial investment in smaller businesses. I think, especially from local government, there is this, what I've noticed is that local government, even foundations, grant makers, they shy away from investing directly in small private companies, led by people of color. It's like we're talking about, closing the wealth gap. We're talking about closing the wealth gap, but we're not willing to invest in small private firms that are ran and owned by people of color. So we default to, cooperatives, land trusts, things which are great in terms of, they're great in terms of creating a democratic process, for a private industry or getting people involved. and creating affordable, rents, affordable products, et cetera. But they don't always create wealth. So we have to be specific about how are we talking about wealth. We can't keep talking about, the wealth gap, has a lot to do with finances, so we need to be financially investing in, people, businesses, Black businesses, people of color businesses, et cetera. I'm gonna move on. There's 2 questions that we want to talk to. The first question is, we have a record number of BIPOC legislators, including the first and Representative Rena Moran chairing the powerful Ways and Means Committee. What do you hope they can do in developing solutions as their numbers increase?
Can you repeat that? I couldn't hear that.
In short, as BIPOC legislators continue to grow, for example, we have a first and Representative Rena Moran. She's chairing the Powerful Ways and Means Committee. What do you hope that they can do in developing solutions as their numbers increase? So as the number of BIPOC legislators continue to increase, what do you hope that they can do on this topic?
I will start out by stating representation matters. It really does, particularly in these spaces that communities of color, particularly Black people, and even more specifically Black women, have been sort of systemically barred from in past years. And so to have a Black woman, and I know a bit about Representative Moran's story. She grew up in Chicago like I did. She grew up, she talks openly and honestly about, receiving public assistance, and as a child in her family and as an adult in her life prior to joining the state legislature. And so having people in those roles that really understand the challenges and the issues that impact communities of color and women and low-income communities, Black people specifically, is really critical to how policy gets made. I would hope that seeing these representatives. I have a new senator that is of Somali descent, representing my community at the state legislature, a woman of color as my state representative. We have a Muslim woman representing us in Congress. Myself, I'm on the city council. We have my county commissioner is a Black woman. Representation does matter. However, we as residents, as citizens, as cultural workers, as community workers, we have to continue to push and help make those changes to it doesn't let us off the hook. But I hope that we can see policies and initiatives that serve to lift up these inequities, these inequalities, and address them in real systemic and substantial ways. And I think, having people in those roles, we have a much better opportunity to do those things.
I fully agree. And I think it's really exciting that people came together. Not only did people like, Andrea Jenkins and Angela Conley and other people step up to run for office, We had people, they brought people together to get them elected. I think that representation does matter. I think that when we elect people who look like us, more often than not, we're going to get outcomes that are more in our favor. I think additional to that, when people see people like Andrea Jenkins and Rena Moran, they too are inspired to run for office themselves because they're like, I see myself in them. I see myself in their story. I see myself in their leadership. I see myself now in those positions. In addition to that, though, we can't just get them elected and leave them alone, right? That part of the battle is getting elected. Part of the battle is getting a gavel and being able to run a powerful Ways and Means Committee for the state of Minnesota. The other part of it, though, is that those barriers that Andrea had identified earlier still exist, even if we did win the election, right? They still exist, even if we're in the minority, or I'm sorry, in the majority of our Congress or in our state house or whatever. Those barriers still exist. And so it makes Rena's job easier, what makes Andrea's job easier, what makes some of our other Black elected officials' jobs easier, is if we, as their constituents, provide them the political cover that they need to act on our behalf, right? That if we're going to say, we want you to divest money from the police department, we're going to also be on the ground and do the work to make it easier for you to make that case, right? That if we say, we want you to spend this money or raise these taxes or lower them or whatever, we're going to do the work on the ground that makes it easier and provides the cover to make that case. And so I used to work for a city council member, and oftentimes in Minneapolis, and oftentimes it was very lonely for her and for her colleagues because, everybody worked hard to get us elected. Everybody was so happy and grateful. And then once it came time to make hard decisions, you could hear crickets. We didn't get the calls of support. We didn't get people saying we're going to put in some time and volunteer. We didn't get people writing in and making comments at the budget committee so that the work that we're trying to do actually reflects the stories that they've shared with us, right? So to answer your question, it's great that we're here. It's great that we've elected so many people. Representation matters. I think for a long time, folks in the Black community and other marginalized communities have been fighting to be heard. Been fighting to be seen. And now that we've gotten a lot of these seats, now I think the next step is to be heard, and then to be felt, right? So it's beautiful that we have representation, but now I want to make sure that we create the conditions where the representation is heard, and ultimately that level of leadership and impact is then felt. And so let's support our Black electeds, right? They face barriers that other elected officials don't face. It's not enough to be the first, right? Being the first was a huge accomplishment. Now what can we do now that you're the first? Well, now what can we do to make sure that you aren't the last? Now what can we do to make sure that your leadership looks different than somebody else's leadership in that role? Because we're here to support you, and you're reflecting our stories, and we're creating the environment and the conditions where those two things, the gap between those two things are small, and you can actually do some good work. So congratulations to Representative Moran. I think she's going to do a really great job this next session as the chair of the Ways and Means Committee at our State House.
I agree that we do need to continue representing. Supporting our BIPOC legislators. I also think our BIPOC legislators, as they develop solutions, and continuing, building and strengthening their relationship, with communities, both the general population, residents, but also their business community as well. Helping the community, build capacity to be able to take advantage of solutions that they propose. Whether that's tax credits, whether that's a new program that the county or cities can take advantage of. Helping build capacity in order for businesses and individuals to be able to navigate those systems. Oftentimes, what I notice is that they get elected and they get swept under politics. Their job is very busy, so they don't always can't always keep a pulse on what's happening on the ground level. So they rely on close relationships. But thinking about ways, as you're developing solutions, also thinking about ways of how do those solutions get, how do people take advantage of those solutions, so they're not just sit on a shelf somewhere. Our next question is, how do you think community organizers and activists can educate the community about the solutions proposed by BIPOC elected officials and government liaisons?
How can activists?
Yeah, how do you think community organizers and activists can educate the community about the solutions proposed by BIPOC elected officials and government liaisons?
I mean, I think that is a very important role and aspect for organizers to play. It is definitely I mean, yeah, and I think they do. I look at a group like the Black Visions Collective, who I'm going to be on a Zoom call with in about 28 minutes now at the University of Minnesota. But they have, you know, they have this block by block strategy of really recruiting people in Minneapolis to understand the issues around their mantra, which is defund the police, and creating a narrative, creating a platform for people to be able to understand what that means. They host virtual seminars now that we are in this sort of, you know, the age of coronavirus. They prepare documents that serve to educate people around the issues that they are concerned about. I mean, it's just really important to do the hard work of organizing. And if you understand what the basic principle of community organizing is, like one-on-one relationships, building relationships with people. I think that's what needs to happen in order to bring attention and awareness to those issues that are impacting our communities deeply and broadly, and how we get people engaged in trying to overcome those issues and concerns.
That's a really great question. And you know, first thing I'd say is that effort is not only important by organizers, they play such a key and integral role in this conversation, but that work is going to take a very long time, right? That when we talk about organizing the community and organizing the public, you're also talking about people who, you know, have full-time jobs already and who are working on taking care of their households or taking care of kids, or again, you know, working multiple part-time jobs to piece together an income, right? Like, you're working with people who don't have additional capacity to be focused on city issues. But organizers play a key role in making sure that they break down these issues in a way that people can understand. And they don't do it in a way that's paternalistic, right? They do it recognizing the fact that there is immense power and immense value in working class people, that there's immense value in people who've been pushed to the sidelines and have been marginalized, that since they've not been invested in, this is a great opportunity to invest in their knowledge capital about how the city operates. Back when I was organizing, and people are still doing this, right? We saw it last night. We would meet one-on-one with workers and those who were most impacted by the policies that we were trying to communicate. And we trained them up to go and be able to testify at budget hearings and be able to go meet with their council member and to share their personal story and how whatever policy that was being proposed or eliminated or what have you, how those things were impacting their day-to-day lives. And so in an era of, you know, we're saturated with so much information, right? My phone goes off every 3 seconds with some notification from something trying to get my attention or sell me something. The role of organizers are so important because they have to make sure that the business of the government or the business of cities is relevant to the lives of their constituents. And that is a very, very hard job to do. They also have to make sure that whatever policy that they're advocating for is also shaped by the real stories of people going through real problems, right? We don't want to pass shiny policy and because it sounds good or looks good. We want to make sure that that policy actually improves people's lives. We don't want a bunch of corporations writing pretty statements and dedicating money to a foundation they've already been donating to. We want them to be accountable to their words and making sure that that money is put like you said, Brother Denetrick, that is invested in Black business, that is invested in those incubators as direct capital, not as assistance programs, but as direct capital, trusting that people are going to make the right decisions based on what they need and what they know about their own lives, right? The final thing I'll say about organizing is that their jobs are also to develop the leadership capacity of the community. When you think about when George Floyd was murdered and we're already in a recession and already suffering from a pandemic, there were a lot of leaders that organically emerged from that moment just by, again, going block by block or making sure that their neighbor was checked in on or taken care of, or found their voice as they were advocating for changes to the police department. How do we capture that and make sure that we can retain that and sustain that for the long haul, right? If your interest was piqued in public policy because George Floyd was murdered, how do we keep you on the path to public participation? If you as an organization or a corporation is just now talking about race and just now talking about reparations and reparative justice, what is the work that we need to do to keep you on that path and to keep you engaged in that conversation and to make sure that this isn't like a moment that, it happens like a blip and then we move on from it. I think that's the difficult work that we have ahead of us, that there were a lot of people's interests that were piqued during this, and we got to find a way to retain that and capture that and keep it sustained, because this ain't the only fight that we're going to have. These big kind of catastrophic moments are increasingly becoming the rule and not the exception. So that our solutions then must be long-term as well if we're going to continue to deal with these, frankly, cataclysmic moments.
As I'm looking at this question, I might flashing back to like the days when I used to work at Harrison, and I'm like, it's not a one-way street. Like community organizing activists, they're not just educating the community, but they're also being educated by the community. And I think sometimes that solutions get proposed that don't actually make sense because the public official, or whether elected official, government liaisons aren't actually educated about what the community's needs are, or they're proposing solutions to needs that haven't been defined by the community. So I would say that a role of community organizers and activists is to help build the capacity of community members to be able to define their own needs, to be able to define the problem, and then define what solutions are gonna, that they need to solve that problem. And then, for those community, help build the capacity of community members to, educate elected officials on how to, so it has to be like, how do community organizers have a very tough job because they're bridging the gap between elected officials, between government liaisons and the community. But also, I think there's a need for community organizers to also have, they need to also build relationships with the private sector too. Because they have to you have to understand how the private sector works in order to just as much you understand policy. And there's a big disconnect in that. That's one thing. That's how I got into real estate development, because I felt like I was getting a grasp on, how policy worked, how to analyze policy, but I didn't understand real estate development. Like, I didn't understand how to take, this idea proposed by policy and actually make it work in a capitalist society that we operate in. So it's like, how do community organizers, how do they also educate the private sector, and how do they educate elected officials, and not just educate community members? I believe we have about 3 minutes left. I think it's in 11:45. Are there any other last minute questions that you all would like to ask us, or any last minute thoughts?
This is Raki again. And I just think it would be a good idea for, folks who are really trying to do the work and all of us really, to drop your LinkedIns or emails and titles so we can stay connected. But y'all let me know what y'all think about that.
I'll put my contact information in the chat really quick. I just got a note saying that we only have 3 minutes left, and let's wrap it up with our 1 minute closing. So I'll go first here. I want to first say thank you to Council Vice President Jenkins and Mr. Powers here for joining today. Really appreciate Tawana and the Center of Economic Inclusion for hosting this panel. And I learned a lot today, and I was really grateful to be able to chat with you all. The thing I'll close out on is that it took centuries for us to get to the point where we're at now, right? Centuries of oppression and violations of our rights and all these other things. And I think it's going to take us a little bit to get out of this. I don't think it's going to take centuries to get out of this, but it's going to take a whole lot of work for us to get out of this. And we need all hands on deck, right? No matter what sector you find yourself in, or state of business that you find yourself in, or age or position in life or what have you, there's something for you to contribute to this moment. There's some sort of insight or knowledge or perspective or sweat equity or partnerships or money or something that you can contribute to for us to continue to have this conversation and for us to make the kind of investments that we need to make to alleviate us from these things. The fact that we're having this conversation gives me a lot of hope. Looking back on how long it took to have a mainstream public debate about reparations and reparative justice and how we need to right the wrongs of the past if we're ever going to be resilient or just or equitable in the future. So thanks you all for being here. I'll put my email address and phone number in the chat. I would love to connect with anyone who wants to connect further about this or resilience or any other of the topics that we discussed today. Thanks so much.
In closing,
oh, go ahead, Andrea.
Oh yeah, no, thank you. In closing, I would just I'd certainly echo everything that Ron just said, particularly acknowledging that we didn't get here overnight, and it's going to take us time to dig ourselves out of this hole, and we have to continue to do all the other things that are really important to making life happen, as well as address the inequitable harms of the past. It is a incremental process, as it were, and particularly in my work as an elected official, no elected official can serve forever. I mean, as human beings, we don't live forever. So we have to be in this sort of relay race kind of mentality, that, each one of us does what we can to move the ball forward. And we need to be training and supporting and lifting up young leaders to come behind us and to continue to carry that work forward. I am happy to be leading this conversation around truth and reconciliation at the city. I invite all of you to join into this conversation as we begin to roll out some input strategies to hear from multiple communities around how people can be engaged and can be involved in doing this work. Or, and if you don't live and work in Minneapolis, you can start this conversation in your own communities. I noticed earlier that the president of the Duluth City Council was on this call, as well as, Commissioner Tony Carter, Ramsey County Commissioner Tony Carter. Like, there are a number of influencers and policymakers and really amazing people. I'm looking at all the names. You can start this work in your own organizations, your own communities, because every institution is going to have to shift and change. There are no, it was really interesting after George Floyd passed away. I'm sorry, let me be real clear. After George Floyd was murdered, a number of institutions stated that they were breaking ties with the Minneapolis Police Department, the University of Minnesota, several law firms, corporations. But the reality, my comment was, until you have really resolved and made amends and repaired the harms that your institution has done, and every one of them is complicit, then you don't have standing to really criticize the city of Minneapolis. We all have to be in this work together to shift and transform our society into a more righteous, more just, more equitable place for everybody to live. And I love the frame that Ron led us off with. It's not just Black Lives Matter, it's all Black Lives Matter.
For sure, thank you, Andrea and Ron. I think you guys, summed it up. I'll just leave off with, again, we're not in a race. Everybody's defining the problem each and every day. And trying to find new solutions. And that, as long, but you can't define the problem in a vacuum. Like, you can't define it just by yourself. So continue having conversations, with your coworkers, with your neighbors, with everybody around you. So that we have a more profound understanding of what these issues are, even though we all feel the issue. How do we actually be able to communicate communicate it, and then also just to reiterate that we do need to slow down, like everything, like it isn't a race. I think oftentimes these conversations, everybody's in a hurry to find an answer, but we're not going to find an answer overnight. Just like these problems didn't, they didn't develop overnight. And speaking from a private sector perspective, just to local government officials, be more willing to put your foot on the brake, slow things down. I think oftentimes, the narrative is that we have to, that I hear from the local government leaders is that we have to move fast because the market is moving fast. But the market is going to respond to you just as much as you're responding to the market. It's like, let's be real. It's like we have just as much as we have. Yes, the population in St. Paul, Minneapolis is growing, but everybody that's moving here ain't middle class. Yeah, everybody ain't got the funds, to move into all of the developments that we're building. And we got just as many people that are going homeless. Just as many people that are going hungry. And I'd argue there are more people going hungry and homeless that are in the city every day than there are people that are moving into the city. So let's slow down and focus on issues that are right in front of us.
Thanks, everybody. I really need to jump off. This was a great dialogue, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks to the Center for Economic Inclusion. I'm so sad that I'm not going to be able to hear the keynote by Nicole Hannah-Jones. I think she developed one of the most influential projects of the 21st century thus far, the 1619 Project. And if you're not familiar with it or you don't have a copy of it, get a copy of it, read it. I teach it in my poetry course because it's got 9 amazing poems in it, as well as really, really insightful, informative, and urgent essays. So you all are in for a treat if you go to her lecture, and I'm deeply committed to this struggle and looking forward to continuing to work with all of you in the future. Thank you so much.